May on course to postpone third vote and agree a lengthy delay to Brexit. Boris torpedoes PM's hopes ahead of EU summit amid fury among Brexiteers for calling them unpatriotic. Theresa May could now shelve the third vote on her deal that had been expected on Tuesday, and make her next move asking the EU for a Brexit extension after several rebel Brexiteer MPs including Boris Johnson refused to back her. The Prime Minister is said to prefer calling off a third vote on her deal if she has no chance of winning it before Thursday's EU summit, and if she has not secured backing by then will ask EU leaders to agree a delay of Brexit of up to 2 years. She could then use that prospect to crank up the pressure on her MPs by holding a vote just days before Britain had been due to leave on March 29. Boris Johnson last night urged MPs to vote down Mrs May's deal for a third time if it is put to a vote this week, and warned in his Daily Telegraph column that it gives the EU an indefinite means of blackmail against the UK. In a direct attack on Mrs May, Boris Johnson paints her and her team as collaborators in the final sabotage of Brexit just 11 days before Britain is due to leave the EU. Today crisis talks with the DUP continue, and if the Northern Irish Party backs Mrs May's deal a number of Eurosceptic Tories could follow, but the senior ERG source predicts that even with the DUP on board, the PM would still lose by 30 to 40 votes. David Davis says if the DUP moves then she has a 50-50 chance of winning, but said still may not vote for the deal, while former ministers Priti Patel and Dominic Raab are expected to rebel even if Mrs May manages to win over Arlene Foster's party. But Brexit ringleader Jacob Rees-Mogg is softening as he insisted Mrs May's deal was better than staying in for months or years, however bad it is. Mr Rees-Mogg told LBC, "I genuinely haven't made up my mind. There is a hierarchy. No deal is better than Mrs May's deal, but Mrs May's deal is better than not leaving. I don't think we will get another chance to leave the European Union." The thought that if you get 2 years for something better is hopelessly optimistic. Mrs May could now tee up a longer delay to Brexit at an EU summit on Thursday, ensuring Tories who vote down her deal must also accept the blame for a lengthy delay to leaving the EU. Downing Street has said ministers will want to be sure there is a realistic prospect of success before deciding to call a third meaningful vote this week. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said that if the deal was passed by the Commons she would go to the EU summit in Brussels on Thursday to ask for a short technical extension to the Article 50 withdrawal process. If there is no Commons vote for the deal, the spokesman said she would ask for a longer delay, which would mean Britain holding elections to the European Parliament. The spokesman said that if the vote was to be held before Mrs May goes to Brussels, the government will have to table a motion by the end of business on Tuesday at the latest. Her final pitch to Tory Brexiteers backfired yesterday after saying her opponents are unpatriotic if they do not back her Brussels divorce, but warned them, "We will not leave the EU for many months, if ever." The former Foreign Secretary urged her to postpone the vote and use a forthcoming EU summit to seek real change on the Irish backstop. Mr Johnson said, "It would be absurd to hold the vote before that has even been attempted." Despite this pressure, Mrs May received a string of major endorsements for her Brexit deal last night that gave fresh hope it could pass within days. In a significant boost for the PM, former Chancellor Norman Lamont urged his fellow Brexiteers to focus on the prize of leaving the EU and back the deal. Writing on the page opposite, the Eurosceptic grandee warns wavering MPs that history will not understand if it is Conservative MPs who prevent us claiming our self-government. Mrs May is hoping to build momentum behind her deal today with an agreement with the DUP that could bring dozens of Eurosceptics on board. In a major intervention last night, Northern Ireland's former First Minister David Trimble also dropped his objections to the so-called Irish backstop. The Nobel Peace Prize winner praised Mrs May for securing substantive concessions on the backstop, adding, "The chances of the PM getting the deal through Parliament have improved." Former Vote Leave chief Matthew Elliott also came out for the deal, warning Eurosceptic MPs, "It's May's deal or nothing." But, with the trickle of Eurosceptic MPs declaring their support still failing to turn into a flood, the prospects for the deal remain on a knife edge. Mrs May was last night still deciding whether or not to press ahead with tomorrow's planned vote on her Brexit deal. Philip Hammond and Liam Fox both said it could be pulled if it looked like it would be defeated a third time. Downing Street was braced for Boris Johnson to double down on his opposition. And Tory sources said fellow leadership hopeful Dominic Raab was also indicating he would help Labour vote down the deal for a third time. "No deal will prove to be the precursor to a very good deal indeed," wrote the Tory MPs, including former ministers Owen Paterson, Sir John Redwood and David Jones. "Our moral course is clear. It is not our fault that we are confronted by two unacceptable choices, but it will be our fault if we cast a positive vote in favour of either for fear of the other." Mr Johnson said Mrs May's agreement would leave the UK in a position of almost unbearable weakness for subsequent talks on trade, risking transforming the country into a kind of economic colony of Brussels. The backstop arrangement, under which the UK remains in a customs union until both sides agree at trade deal, gives the EU an indefinite means of blackmail, said the Brexit figurehead. "Unless we have some change, and at present, in the immortal phrase, nothing has changed, it is hard to ask anyone who believes in Brexit to change their mind," he said. There is an EU summit this week. It is not too late to get real change to the backstop. It would be absurd to hold the vote before that has even been attempted. The 10 DUP MPs are viewed by Downing Street as pivotal, not just for the votes they provide but the influence of their stance on Conservative Eurosceptics. DUP MLA Jim Wells told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "We still have a huge difficulty with the backstop, because we see it as a waiting room for constitutional change. We could find ourselves locked in there forever in effect, and once you get in you can never get out. We have to have a mechanism where we can escape the backstop." Mr Wells said the proposed gentleman's agreement that any changes to Northern Ireland's relationship with the EU would be mirrored by the rest of the UK might prove unenforceable. And he denied that the DUP was taking part in a financial auction for its support, insisting that money is not being discussed on the table at the moment. Mr. Wells estimated that as many as 30 Tory MPs will never vote for Mrs May's deal, meaning that a third defeat was inevitable with or without DUP support. So far the number of Tories publicly switching positions falls far short of the 75 MPs Mrs May needs to change sides. Bolton West MP Chris Green told BBC Radio 4's Westminster Hour, "I want to vote against it because I don't believe when Parliament defeated it by the biggest margin in the history of Parliament that was because it was in any way a good deal, and the substance of the deal hasn't changed." But he added that a shift in the DUP's position would have a big impact and the implications of rejecting the deal for a third time weighed heavily on him because it could lead to a general election, and we don't know how that will pan out. As part of the effort to put pressure on Tory hardliners and the DUP, Chancellor Philip Hammond and International Trade Secretary Liam Fox took to the airwaves on Sunday to make clear that the Prime Minister would not chance a third defeat on her deal. And Security Minister Ben Wallace, a close ally of Mr Johnson who shared his abortive bid for the leadership in 2016, urged the former Foreign Secretary and other Tory Brexiteers to back Mrs May's deal. How will Brexit be delayed and will MPs get a vote on it? Why is Brexit Day set on March 29, 2019? There are two reasons. The first because it is the second anniversary of Britain formally telling the EU it wished to leave by invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. This triggered a 2-year divorce negotiation that will expire on March 29. The second reason is because British laws on leaving specify 11 p.m. on March 29, 2019, as exit day. Writing this into law triggered a political fight in the Commons because it was not actually necessary but the government insisted on doing it. What needs to happen for the date to be changed? There are again two processes. First, Theresa May will need to go to Brussels and get political agreement for delay and the terms on which it happens. The second is British law will need to be changed to amend the date of Brexit. This will require a vote in both Commons and Lords. What will happen at the EU Council? Whatever the terms of delay, the Prime Minister will ask EU leader for what she wants and then they will make a decision, without her. Brexit issues are decided only by the 27 remaining states, without a British say. A delay to Brexit must be agreed unanimously. All EU states have a full veto. Mrs May has said if MPs have passed her deal, she will ask EU for a short extension of a couple of months to sort out UK law. If MPs have not passed the deal, she will have to ask for a much longer extension. What needs to happen in the UK? Once a new date is agreed, the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 has to be amended. This must be done via statutory instrument, a form of secondary legislation that changes the law without going through the full parliamentary process. A minister will table the C in Parliament setting out the new date for Brexit. The law says it must be done via the affirmative procedure. This means there will have to be a straight vote in both the Commons and Lords, with no possibility of amendment. At this point, almost certainly. We know from last week there are enough votes in the Commons to block no deal. The EU also does not want no deal and is thought likely to agree both versions of the extension plan at the summit. Can a no-deal Brexit still happen on March 29? Yes, if there is no political agreement on changing the date at the EU Council or Parliament rejects the C, Brexit will still happen as the legal default. Could Brexit happen on March 29 with the deal? No, even if MPs pass the deal this week, there is no practical way to get all the necessary laws through in time. Delay could in theory be limited to a couple of weeks, potentially. I know Boris very well and I know he's passionate about leaving the European Union, Mr. Wallace told BBC Radio 4's Today programme. If he is passionate about that, he will recognise that voting for this deal is the way to deliver Brexit and the way to deliver leaving the EU. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote for it. Conservative MP Sir John Redwood dismissed Theresa May's withdrawal agreement as a very expensive invitation to more talks about possibly getting out with a sensible trade agreement, or perhaps not, with the ultimate problem that Northern Ireland might not be allowed out at all. Sir John told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "It violates the Conservative manifesto in many important ways. The manifesto is very clear that no deal is better than a bad deal." Said that a lot of Conservative MPs shared his concerns, but declined to estimate how many would vote against Mrs May's deal in a third meaningful vote. "It's a lot of people, and it goes far wider than the ERG, European Research Group, who have been particularly keen to have the right kind of Brexit." Sir John said that at this week's EU summit, Mrs May should say that we are going to be leaving on March 29 in accordance with her oft-repeated mantra, but that we would like a free trade agreement. And if they would just agree to talks on a free trade agreement, we needn't impose barriers on each other. Some senior figures believe tomorrow's vote should be delayed until next week, by which time Mrs May is expected to have requested an extension of Article 50. Cabinet Minister urged the PM to delay, adding, "Whenever it comes it is going to be incredibly tight. I think the DUP will come across, but we also need Boris and Robin Rees-Mogg to have a chance. Then, we will need some more Labour MPs to come on board. At the start of a crunch week on Brexit." Philip Hammond angered Eurosceptics by saying it was now physically impossible to leave on March 29 following Parliament's decision to back a Brexit delayed. Dutch PM Mark Rutte likened Mrs May to the Monty Python character the Black Knight, who refused to give in even after having his limbs chopped off. Former Work and Pensions Secretary Esther McVey said she would reluctantly back the deal, but called for Mrs May and other feeble negotiators to quit. David Davis urged Eurosceptic MPs to back the deal, saying it was capable of rescue in Brussels. Mrs May's deal suffered a record 230 vote defeat in January and lost again by 149 votes last week. Tories believe they are close to sealing an agreement with her DUP backers, which could see dozens of Eurosceptic Tories reluctantly fall into line behind the deal. Mr Hammond yesterday indicated the DUP could be handed more cash for Northern Ireland if they agree to back the PM's deal. He told the BBC Sandra Marshall, "This isn't about money. It's about a political assurance. Well, look, we are coming up to a spending review and we will have to look at all budgets, including devolved block grant budgets.